I want to start by thanking once again Beit Avichai. This has been a true pleasure. And I want to thank everyone on screen. All of you who've come back week after week to listen to all of us speak about events from hundreds of years ago and show such great interest in them. And I really think that together we're seeing why history matters and why learning about the past is so significant today and so meaningful. I want to say on behalf of myself and my students, my research group, that this has been a wonderful experience for us, thinking about how the things we do in our research are related today, and even more importantly, how we can make them relevant to a wider audience of people who don't spend all their time studying the past. So today we have two speakers, and I'll do some summarizing at the end, and I'll also be collecting some questions from all of you. But what I want to do right now is simply introduce them and let them start speaking and teaching us. We're talking about memory and resettlement today. And like Tamara said, I think that so many of the articles we all read in the newspapers nowadays are about how after COVID-19, things will never be the same. Cities will change, families will change, work will change, education will change. The way we spend our free time will change. Every time you open the newspaper, you can read a different prediction. And one of the questions I think that comes up for all of us is, what do we remember of before? How does that change what happens afterwards? And what patterns or what habits remain so deeply ingrained that they either don't change or they take a long time to change? And our two speakers today will be addressing some of those questions in their presentation. So Albert Kohn received a BA from Columbia University, an MPhil from Cambridge, and is about to embark on his doctoral dissertation. Originally from Philadelphia, we are very happy to have him part of our group here in Jerusalem this year and staying with us next year. Albert is especially interested in households. He wrote two, not one, BA honors theses, one on Zmirot Shabbat, which is one aspect of a household, how Jews sang their Zmirot, and the others on Jews in medieval Christian exempla, stories that were told for moral purposes about Jews. His MPhil, written at Cambridge, was about rituals that have to do with going to sleep among both Jews and Christians in the High Middle Ages. And he is currently very interested in a different aspect of houses. He's interested in the rental system and how Jews either owned or rented properties throughout the Middle Ages. Today, he will talk about Jewish migration after the plague and what happened when Jews had to find a new home, what they took with them, and what they left behind. Our second speaker, Andreas Lehnertz, did his BA, MA, and PhD at the University of Trier. His BA and MA were in history and German philology, and his doctoral thesis that he completed just 2 years ago was about Jewish seals in the medieval German kingdom. What I mean by seals, when I say seals, is seals people used to sign their documents and to notarize them and to authenticate them. His PhD is about authentication and self-representation of Jewish women and men. Andreas's doctoral dissertation is about to be published, and he has been part of our project for the past 2 years. He's now working on Jewish craftspeople. So what did Jews do? What were their professions? Far broader and far wider than anything we might think in a stereotypical way, like moneylenders. Today, he will talk about people who returned to their homes after being expelled during the Black Death. And I want to add one more word about Andreas. It is our very special pleasure to welcome him here today. It is true that what you are hearing, he could have done from Germany, but Andreas went home for a week right before Purim and made it back here just last week. So we're very glad that he's back here in Israel with us and speaking to us from quarantine. So the way we're going to run the session today is first Albert will speak, then Andreas will speak. If you have any questions, please send them in the chat or send them to me. I will try to pose those questions to our speakers afterwards. And at the very end, I'll say a few words of summary. Albert, please begin.
Great. Thank you, Elisheva. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I just want to echo what Dr. Baumgarten said and thank Beit Avichai for having us here. This has been a really wonderful opportunity for our group to share our research and we really hope that everyone's been enjoying it. I also want to thank specifically Professor Baumgarten, who not only organizes our group and is moderating tonight, but really got this program going. And last, but really far from least, thank you goes to Andreas, my co-presenter, who is always so kind and quick to share his immense learning. So over the course of our series, we've seen how during the Black Death, Jews were victim of both a medical epidemic and Christian violence. Today, I will focus on one form of violence that Jews experienced during this time, namely forcible removal from their communities. Being driven from their homes was in no way a new feature of medieval Jewish life. In the 13th century, Jews were expelled from various English towns and then from the entire island in 1290. Later, Jews were driven from areas in France beginning in the 12th century and then were expelled from the whole region in 1306 and again in 1394. In the century following the Black Death, though, Jews were for the first time driven en masse from their communities in Germany. Elisheva Kohn, an Italian Jewish historian from the 16th century, observes this phenomenon in his discussion of the Black Death. He writes that in the year 1348, the Jews were expelled from the Kingdom of Hungary, and they were also chased from their domiciles in other countries in that year. After the course of 1 year, most of the Jews of Germany had also to drink from the bent cup of frenzy, meaning that they were also expelled. According to Elisheva Kohn, the years following the Black Death were marked by Jewish dislocation. In 1348, this was primarily a result of Jews fleeing the persecution. But in the following decades, Jews were similarly displaced by formal expulsions. In this map, you can see some of the cities from which Jews were expelled in the centuries after the Black Death. What is important to recognize is that unlike the famed expulsions of Jews from England and France, Jews were never driven out of the entirety of medieval Germany. Rather, individual Jewish communities were uprooted by localized violence and/or government edicts at varying times. Dislocation in Germany was a local as opposed to a national phenomenon. In this presentation, I want to look at Jewish dislocation in the second half of the 14th century. During the spread of the Black Death in 1348 to 1349, Jews fled their towns in hope of escaping the persecutions. In the decades and centuries afterwards, particularly after 1390, many cities and towns used formalized expulsion as, in the words of the famed Jewish historian Saul Baron, a somewhat more civilized way of eliminating Jews. While these two causes of dislocation are substantially different, they both turn Jews into refugees in search of new homes. Both Andreas and I will use our time with you to address the following questions. Why Jews were driven out? How did Jews experience their dislocation? Where did displaced Jews go? And how did displaced Jews survive? To answer these, we're going to focus on Germany, but occasionally look elsewhere for added substance. You will notice that I included several images of medieval Jews on the move in my slides. Because of time constraints, though, I may not be able to discuss each of them, but I encourage you to appreciate their beauty and use them to help envision the experience of dislocation and migration during the Middle Ages. So let's start with the most basic question. Why were Jews displaced? We have already discussed how violence against Jews in the wake of the Black Death was inspired by accusations that Jews were responsible for the epidemic sweeping across Europe. While claims like this were far-reaching and seemed to provide an explanation for the ensuing violence, they are only part of the story. Already in 1348, various Christian leaders recognized that the accusations against Jews were misguided. The most famous of these defenses came directly from Pope Clement VI. He pointed out that the Jews could not be responsible for the pestilence since they were dying from it just like Christians. Pope Clement suggests that the accusations were instead motivated by economic interests. Because they owed money to and competed in the marketplace with Jews, Christians saw an economic opportunity if Jews were to be removed from the city. Similar economic interests also likely motivated the expulsions of Jews that occurred at the end of the 14th century. When Jews were driven from their cities, whether by formal expulsion or by violence, their property and money could be claimed by governments and residents alike. Even with these reasons to remove Jews from the cities, though, Both violence and formal expulsion rarely went uncontested, meaning that there was not universal agreement that Jews should be attacked or Jews should be expelled from cities. In this account from the contemporaneous Christian chronicler Matthias of Neuenburg, we see an example of a dispute that raged between Christians in and around Basel in 1348. The Matthias notes that the aldermen and even some nobles in Basel strove to protect the Jews from a long-term banishment. But behold, the people, armed with banners, mobbed the councillor's palace. They said, "We won't go away until you change your mind about banishing the Jews." The people cried out again, "We don't want the Jews to stay here anymore." And a meeting was convened of many of the highest ranking representatives from some 3 cities, which still wanted to keep their Jews, but feared the people's outcry. Nonetheless, the Jews were arrested everywhere in those places. This account shows quite clearly that there was not always consensus behind violence and expulsion. On one side, we see the town council, which sought to protect their Jewish residents, and on the other, a mob of locals who demanded their removal. Each of these parties would have been motivated by their independent interests. The mob likely saw an opportunity to free themselves from debt and business competition. The local governors, though, understood that if the Jews were to be removed, they would lose a consistent tax revenue. In every city, this debate would have looked different, as it depended on religious, social, and economic factors in that area. Yet, even with these hopeful protectors, Jews, as we see at the end of this source, could still be attacked and forced to flee their homes. Before we take a look at where they went and how they survived, it is worth contemplating how Jews experienced dislocation. In this image over here, you see a Jewish family packing up their stuff and moving out of a city. But while we have a few of these images, we fortunately do not have many first-person descriptions of the experience of dislocation. Those fleeing persecutions rarely had the wherewithal to describe their experiences in writing. One surviving first-hand account of a Jew driven from his home does provide a momentary glimpse of his experience. The following note was inscribed in a manuscript by Dias Quinoni, a prominent Jew who lived in the small town of Le Baume in Provence before its Jewish population was destroyed in 1348. He writes, "This book is a brand saved from the fire," meaning that the book that he inscribed this note in. It was saved from the fire, the day of wrath that God poured out on the holy community of Le Baume de Sisteron in the fire of his wrath. Only I survived, for I had been summoned 10 days prior to the pogroms to Our Lady the Queen in the city of Avignon, and there I stayed and wept in bitterness of soul. May God in his mercies merit us to see the consolation of Judah and Israel, and the rebuilding of Ariel, and may he merit me to go there, I and my descendants forever. While Dias was saved from the violence, his community was destroyed and he was left a refugee. The pain and tears that he describes was certainly shared with the numerous other Jewish refugees. One might see his refugee mindset in the last few sentences. There he hopes that if God were to one day bring the redemption, Dias and his descendants would have a place to call home forever. Like every refugee from this period and today, he was yearning for a place he could permanently and safely call home. Yet Dias was relatively lucky and found himself safely in Avignon during these violence. But most other Jewish refugees had to actively seek out new places to live. This brings us to our next question. Where did Jewish refugees go? Regardless of why Jews were dislocated, they needed to find new places to reside. Andreas is going to talk about Jews who took temporary shelter in castles around their towns in the wake of the Black Death persecutions. In addition to castles, surrounding small villages could also harbor small numbers of Jews. Here, though, I want to focus on more long-term solutions. The most obvious solution for many Jews, was to take up residence in cities and regions in which violence and/or expulsion had not occurred. even at the peaks of tension, there were always areas that were saved from the carnage. Because such communities had the religious and social institutions that Jews relied upon, settling in them was the best option for most Jews on the run. Yosef HaKohen, our 16th century Jewish historian whose observation we opened with, points this out. He writes that only those who lived in Vienna and the towns of the Duke of Austria did not hear the voice of the oppressor, for God had mercy on them, and did not permit the Duke to entertain the thought of doing them any harm. Many Jews fled there. Meaning that the area of Austria and also around Vienna was saved from was persecution. Because of the support shown by Duke Albrecht II, the Jewish community of Vienna was protected from the violence in the wake of the Black Death. As a result, Viennese Jews could help their German co-religionists. Vienna was not the sole place of refuge, though. Regensburg, which was a foundation stone of the German Jewish environment, was not struck by persecution, and consequently shows evidence of having taken in large numbers of Jewish refugees in the years after the Black Death. Yet, even all the unscathed Jewish communities could not handle the number of refugees that required support. This was especially true later in the 14th century. Communities were limited by their economic resources, as well as the limits on Jewish immigration instituted by local authorities. As a result, many Jews could not find homes in pre-existing large Jewish communities, and rather rebuilt their lives in entirely new cities and towns. The most important new regions for Jewish settlement emerged not in the wake of the Black Death, but towards the end of the 14th century. These migrations were largely sparked by the cancellation of debts owed to Jews in 1385 and then again in 1390. Even Jews who were not formally expelled realized that they were no longer able to support themselves under these conditions. During that time, Jews fleeing economic oppression and expulsion made their way to northern Italy and Poland. Throughout the 14th century, some German Jews were immigrating to northern Italy. Beginning at the tail end of the century, though, larger waves of German Jews were making the move in search of better economic conditions. In northern Italy, most Jewish migrants from Germany lived in very small villages with Jewish populations of only 1 or 2 families. Yet, some substantial communities did emerge. You can see here on the map that the largest Jewish community of Ashkenaz was in the city of Trieste, and others were also found in Treviso and Cremona. While they technically did not live in Ashkenaz anymore, German immigrants to northern Italy generally separated themselves from their Italian co-religionists and maintained their ancestors' ritual and literary traditions. We actually have a number of Ashkenaz works from medieval Germany that are only maintained in manuscripts from northern Italy, where German Jews moved. Another region of settlement was Poland. Sources indicate that some Jews were living in Poland already during the 12th and 13th century. When rabbinic leaders there, in the 12th and 13th century, rabbinic leaders were in contact with halachic authorities in Western Germany. So we know that they had communities, at least to some extent. At the end of the 14th century, though, new sources begin to appear that point to the presence of a more established Jewish community in Krakow and other cities. This is unsurprising, given that King Casimir III of Poland, who reigned during the Black Death, offered Jews relatively impressive freedoms in hope of encouraging immigration. The major cities of this period were Krakow, Lvov, and Poznan. Compared to the Jewish experience in Germany in the 14th century, Jewish life in Poland was rather calm. This is not to say that the Black Death persecutions and other violent uprisings were entirely absent from Poland, but that compared to Germany, things were better during the second half of the 14th century. The slow migration of Jews eastward at the end of the 14th century and during the 15th century set the stage for European Jewish life in the modern period. So, given this explosion in Jewish migration during the second half of the 14th century, one must ask how these migrating Jews were able to survive. Before pursuing answers, we should keep in mind that migration was not a new part of medieval Jewish life. Medieval Jews were in no way sedentary. Over the 250 years before the Black Death, the amount of Jewish communities in medieval Germany increased more than tenfold. This was done by Jews picking up and moving to new areas without pre-existing Jewish communities, meaning that communities and moving was a new experience for the Jewish community. Of course, though, the violent dislocation of Jews in the decades after the Black Death was a more challenging than simple opportunistic migration. Even Jews who managed to survive the violence and return to their home communities faced immense difficulties that Andreas will describe. Even more so, Jews looking for new places to live had a long road ahead of them. It is really impossible to describe in any detail how Jews were able to manage during these trying times, both because it would be unique in every situation, and also we don't have much source material that would explain that. A major reason, though, for their perseverance that we can see from some sources was the generosity of their neighbors. Whether Jews were moving to pre-existing or entirely new communities, they would have relied heavily upon other Jews opening their homes and wallets to those in need. A rare testimony to such kindness is engraved in a Hebrew tombstone from the end of the 14th century. Found in the Jewish cemetery in Speyer, it records the kindness of one survivor of the Black Death persecutions, who later died in 1364. The tombstone reads, "This sign, or this tombstone, stands at the head of an enlivened man of great action, a scholar and a resident of the study houses. In the time of fury, he rose to the hour, and through him, the blessed God gave to his people, the survivors of the sword, deliverance and provided sustenance and grain to the poor. His house was as open as a desert, a man in whom all could be found, the Honorable Reb Baruch, the son of Reb Eliezer, who died with a good name. May it be God's will that he merit a world that is entirely good." The Jews of Speyer were faced by both violence and repeated expulsion in the years after the Black Death. While the community suffered, this Baruch clearly did what he could to help those in need. It is not entirely clear why Baruch was in such a position, but his good deeds left a lasting impression on the community, as he was remembered for his kindness over 20 years after the trauma in the newly reestablished community of Speyer. As I prepare to pass the microphone over to my colleague, Andreas, I wonder if we can take some encouragement from this Baruch as we reflect upon our own moment of global strife. Just like Baruch in his own time, numerous people have distinguished themselves over the past few months by helping those in need, whether it was by showing up to work in hospitals, delivering supplies to those in need, or offering encouragement. Such people kept the rest of us going. But even more than just encouragement for each of us to follow Baruch and step up to help those in need, it could be even more important that we take inspiration from the Jewish community of Speyer, who chose to actively remember not only their suffering, but also the good deeds of their friends. As we are now, hopefully, or I really hope so, constructing our own memories of this challenging time in the past, we too should strive to remember the sparks of humanity that kept us all going, just like the community of Speyer did. To conclude, I'll bring us back to Yosef Kohn, with whom we started. In the continuation of his comments about Jews taking refuge in Vienna, he remarks that Jews remained until the storm was over. Even after the horrors they experienced, many Jews sought to return to their communities and homes once it was safe. My colleague Andreas is now going to talk to us about why and how Jews did this. So thank you very much.
So I'll start. Thank you very much for the introduction, Professor Elisheva Baumgarten. And thank you, Beit Avichai, for the opportunity to present some of my work today and be part of the series. I also thank my colleague, Albert Kohn, for sharing this session with me and for all the discussions we had in preparation for this paper. We just heard from Albert how Jews leaving their homes in light of persecution during the Black Death. Now, as our series concludes, I would like to talk about how Jews returned to their towns. I shall present the case of a Jewish widow called Margarete, who, with her 3 sons, survived the pogrom in her town called Koblenz, which is situated in Western Germany, as you see in this map. Koblenz is located between Cologne, which was at the topic of Dr. Eyal Levinson's talk about Jewish chivalric culture in Cologne a few weeks ago. And the other city is Frankfurt, which was the city Avia Doron focused upon in her talk about Jews and the economy we heard last week. In my talk, focusing on Koblenz, I shall first ask how Margarete and her 3 sons survived and then resettled in Koblenz after the Black Death. And second, how the reorganization of Jewish communal life might have progressed. My talk begins with the realities after the Black Death. Only seldom do we find reference to survivors of the persecutions and the plague whom we already knew before from pre-plague sources. Some cities, such as Regensburg and Vienna, had effectively protected their Jewish population, as Albert pointed out. Particularly interesting to me, however, are those sources that suggest that Jews survived because they already lived in or gained access to castles like the one we see in this image. This depiction comes from the 15th century Yehuda Haggadah for Pesach. Fortified places, such as this one here, were challenging to besiege, and most cities with Jewish communities in Western Germany along the River Rhine were situated close to one or even several such castles. We have sources showing that Jews sometimes lived in castles or owned them for certain periods. Our Jewish widow Margarete, whom I will focus on, likely sought refuge in a castle close to her town. She was already a member of the Jewish community in Koblenz before the Black Death. Immediately before the pogrom, her community drew up a contract of protection with the Christian urban commune. The Jews agreed to pay a large sum of money, and in return, the Christian municipality promised to protect them. Many other towns drew up similar contracts of protection in the month before the pogroms, and yet most of them turned out to be worth less the price of the parchment they were written upon. The Jews of Koblenz, too, did not receive the protection they needed and expected. However, the contract between the Jews of Koblenz and the municipality also gave them permission to seek shelter in a fortified castle called Ehrenbreitstein if their lives were endangered. Castle Ehrenbreitstein is across the River Rhine, looking down on the city. You see here a drawing of Castle Ehrenbreitstein from 1573, more than 200 years after Margarete's time. The picture gives you a good idea of how close the town was to this castle. If we switch to a modern view from the former castle's plateau, it also gives us an impressive look over Koblenz. The city's center with its former Jewish community was situated in this red square between Rhine and Mosel rivers. While Margarete and her 3 sons might have sought refuge and survived in Castle Ehrenbreitstein, most of the Jewish community did not. For some reason, they did not use their privilege to dwell in the castle and were burned to death in Koblenz. 19 months after the persecution, Margarete, together with her 3 sons, made a contract of resettlement with the Christian urban commune of Koblenz in 1351, March 26. The record is proof of one of the earliest resettlements of a Jewish family after the devastating pogroms of the mid-14th century. It is possible that Margarete visited the city during the preceding 19 months, but official resettlement was a more complicated matter. She had to negotiate with the municipality and prepare the final contract, which has survived in the municipal archives as a copy, which you see here in the image. In this contract of resettlement, Margarete and her 3 sons, Jacob, Joseph, and Baruch, together with their unnamed and unspecified domestic staff, were accepted by the urban commune to live in the town. It says, I quote, that the whole urban commune has taken and accepted us and our heirs and descendants and our domestic servants as their good, established citizens. Being a citizen of a medieval city is different than our modern conception of citizenship. On the most basic level, it meant having certain privileges. These included legal rights the urban commune would fight for. At the same time, citizenship also required one to contribute certain services, such as guarding the city, building the city walls, and, of course, paying taxes. However, the characterization as established citizens we see in the contract of resettlement implies recognition of their prior status and long relationship with the city and its inhabitants. Even before the pogrom in August 1349, Margarete and her family had a history in the town. Koblenz was, after all, their hometown. One cannot but wonder why Margarete, as well as so many Jews in other cities, chose to come back to the place where the persecutions happened. What motivation did she have to return? Indeed, it was her hometown, but why return? Margarete is but one example representing so many others that have yet to be studied. She lived in Koblenz for many years, and maybe she even grew up in it. Her social life was centered around the Jewish community, and there's no doubt that she knew the whole urban space by heart. Her memories were attached to this place. However, there were other reasons for her return as well. Socioeconomically, it appears that Margarete's family was active in money lending. In Koblenz, she would have had customers she could work with once again to make a living for herself, her 3 sons, and her domestic staff. As for legal status, Margarete's status as a citizen too was a substantial motivation to return to her hometown. Generally, cities offered better protection for Jews than more rural settlements, and receiving the status of citizen came with an increased level of security, both legal and social. Another reason to return to Koblenz was the former and still somewhat present communal infrastructure. Koblenz had a Jewish quarter with a synagogue and other institutions such as a ritual bath and a Jewish hospice. But the communal infrastructure that most inspired resettlement in Koblenz was the Jewish cemetery outside the city walls. I'm showing you here an image of the Worms cemetery, since the medieval Jewish cemetery from Koblenz does not exist anymore. Looking at Jewish resettlement after the Black Death reveals a clear pattern. The foremost towns Jews resettled were those with a Jewish cemetery. Cemeteries are places of memory, and recent scholarship has emphasized this importance for Jews in the Middle Ages. We also heard Miri Fenton's talk about Jews and death, which focused on burial practices. This is the reason why an anonymous Jewish man from the later 14th century decided to note the places in which members of his extended family died and were buried, or where they were persecuted. He wrote, "The family of my mother Rivka of blessed memory, was buried in Andernach. Her father, Shlomo of blessed memory, was buried in Frankfurt. Shlomo's father, Rav Meir, was buried in Regensburg. The mother of grandfather Shlomo, Elin, was killed together with 2 of her daughters in the persecution in Gezerah of 1349. My mother's mother, Esther, was buried in Mainz." The author goes on like this for a while and also proceeds in the same way with his father's side. This is a so-called mental map. It draws up the places of persecution and the cemeteries this Jewish man wished to remember. It exemplifies the high importance Jewish cemeteries had. There are other reasons why those towns with Jewish cemeteries were favorite for resettlement. Jewish communities with cemeteries had important legal and economic functions for surrounding smaller Jewish communities, since they centralized Jewish courts, taxation, and burial. Let us go back to Margarete. After her resettlement in Koblenz, she and her family not only had to manage their relationship with the Christian urban commune, which was mainly defined by taxation. They also had to reorganize Jewish communal life. They had to deal with multiple aspects of Jewish daily life. They had to deal with everything. Among their tasks was providing kosher slaughter, as well as kosher wine, synagogue services, Jewish learning, and Jewish festivals. The privilege to do some of these things, such as slaughtering of livestock, had to be negotiated with the Christian urban commune. For example, Jews had to be given the right to sell the non-kosher parts of butchered meat to Christians. But selling this meat to Christian customers was not favorable to Christian butchers, who lobbied against this privilege. In general, however, questions of Jewish communal organization were left in the hands of Jewish communities with little interference from the Christians. The Jewish community was in need of members with economic power who would bear the oftentimes high taxation. Margarethe's family seems to have had the power to support the community financially. When she and her three sons drew up the contract with the Christian urban commune, the level of taxation remained the same amount as the whole Jewish community paid prior to the pogrom. This means that Margarethe and her family were perceived by the municipal government as the entire Jewish community and not just a singular family. To reorganize the Jewish community, Margarethe and her family would also need to fill communal positions, such as the shochet, butcher, the bodek, inspector of meat, chazan, cantor or prayer leader, the shamash, sexton of a synagogue, and the position of the panasim, community leaders. Already half a century before Margarethe's resettlement, the famous and influential Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg answered in a legal decision the question of how to proceed when communal structures had to be set up. He wrote, "Proceed by the majority principle when electing the leader, when appointing prayer leaders, cantors, chazanim, when setting up the alms cash box, when appointing the almoners, when building or tearing down in the synagogue, when extending or remodeling it, when buying a community hall." This is the dance hall, or so-called Tanzhaus Teddy Schechter talked about 2 weeks ago in her talk on Jews and dancing. When extending or remodeling this community hall, when buying a baking house, when extending or remodeling it. In short, all communal needs should be done according to the will of the leaders, elected by the majority. There's little doubt that members of Margarethe's family filled these positions while other Jews gradually settled in Koblenz after them. Margarethe's family also resettled in Koblenz with her explicitly mentioned but unnamed domestic staff. Some Jewish families had significant numbers of servants and domestic staff. They too might have helped assure a minyan, a quorum in the synagogue required to hold services. The synagogue in Koblenz was most likely the same building as prior to the pogrom. However, the scarce sources from the first years after Margarethe's resettlement in Koblenz provides little information. It is not before the 1360s, more than a decade later, that we know for sure that further families came and lived in this community. And yet, it seems that Margarethe was somewhat successful. In the year 1355, a Jewish man named Moses appeared to have organized and lived in the Jewish hospice, which already existed before the Black Death. He likely was Margarethe's grandson, and perhaps ran the Jewish hospice for a while. In this hospice, usually poor and visiting Jews stayed. It needed once again a stable financial situation of the whole Jewish community. To reorganize Jewish learning, scholars had to be present in Koblenz as well. In the later 14th century, an anonymous Jewish chronicler wrote about his youth. He tells us what cities he had lived in. Among these towns was Koblenz, where this Jewish chronicler explicitly came to study. This must mean that by the 1370s, Koblenz was back on the map as a center of Jewish learning in the region. But who taught these students? Again, it is Margarete's family who seems to have filled this position. Jacob, the son of Margarete, is known as both scholar and rabbi. He wrote commentaries on two of the most important 14th century Jewish legal works, Sefer Panas and Sefer Sharei Dura. Jacob's son, Moses, who likely ran the Jewish hospice for some time, had a personal seal in his seal's inscription, and in his seal's inscription, he calls his father, my teacher, the rabbi, Morenu Harabi. Moses, too, was called a rabbi multiple times by Christian officials. The seal indicates his social and legal status. It also displays nicely his family's name, since Margarete, her son, and her grandson Moses used the Hebrew family name Shoshan Emek, Rose of the Valley. The seal image points to the family name by showing 3 roses in a shield, referring to the famous liturgical poem called Shoshan Emek. But most of all, the titles and the presentation of the seal mean that Jewish learning had somewhat successfully been re-established, and young Jewish men could come to study in Koblenz. Like Jacob the rabbi and Moses, the innkeeper of the hospice and later rabbi, many such positions within the Jewish community had to be filled. Some of the communal positions were distributed among only a few people. This is a common phenomenon during the decades following the Black Death, when communities were small. As we might imagine, in most Jewish communities, not enough people were present to hold the various important communal positions individually, and clearly not everyone could be a bodek or shochet or chazan. Our anonymous Jewish chronicler, who came to study in Koblenz, left the town for a while only to return again in early 1382. He tells us, and I was there in Koblenz, a shochet, a bodek, and an innkeeper, achsanai, for the hospice or for the Jewish community. And he lived in Koblenz for another 5 years. In the decades after the pogrom in Koblenz, the economic activity of the members of this Jewish community became very significant. 2 of Margarete's sons, Jacob and Joseph, were active in money lending. Jacob's son Moses married a widow named Reinette in the late 1360s. This woman, Reinette, became the most prominent Jewish moneylender in her region and oftentimes conducted her business alone rather than with Moses. Maybe this was the perfect possibility for Moses to study and learn while his wife took care of the economic needs. We often think of men as moneylenders, but women too were very active in business, and I just recall the example Nurit Derma gave us last week for the Jews and the economy in Paris, where Christian apprentices came to learn a craft from Jewish women. With Reinette and Margarete, however, we see 2 prominent women in this family from Koblenz who took upon them important tasks of resettlement and reconstitution of the communities after the Black Death. The years from the 1380s to the expulsion of the Jewish community in 1418, 1419, would usher in a new phase of the Jewish community and Margarete's descendants. It marks a topic for a different paper. But if we focus especially on what we've seen here in the case of Margarete and her family, then we find the Jewish resettlement of communities in Germany happened for many reasons. Economic, legal, and social reasons brought many Jews back to their communities. But the history of Jewish resettlement in Germany after the Black Death has yet to be written. I emphasize that my colleague from Trier, Michael Schlachter, is currently writing his PhD thesis about this topic. My final slide gives you a few bibliographical notes, although in German, including his most recent work. While my study is only a case study for one city, we can gain a fuller picture of how resettlement and reorganization of Jewish communal life happened by studying a larger number of such cities. as we begin to move more freely, and make attempt to restart our social lives in a familiar but slightly different places after the peak of COVID-19. I too look forward to seeing how life will be reorganized as we move on with our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Andreas and thank you to Albert for two very, very interesting talks. I've had a number of questions reach me through the private chat, so I will ask a few of them now and let both of them respond. The first question to Albert, which is, what was the role of the Christian clergy in some of those events that you described in which the Jews were expelled or dislocated from their homes? And were they too part of that crowd that was yelling that you should banish the Jews that you described in one of your sources? So that's question number one for Albert. Question number two for Andreas. There are a few questions that reached me. So one question is very straightforward, which is what happened to the cemetery of Koblenz? And the second question, which I guess could be turned to both of you, and then maybe if we have time, we can ask a few more questions about that, is this fascinating example of Margarete and her family, and afterwards her granddaughter-in-law, I guess would be Reinette, who's married to her grandson, Moses. How prominent were women like that you saw? You also hinted to Nurit's talk last week. So how prominent or how common were women like that who had such economic positions? I'll just add something you didn't tell, but one of my favorite facts about Reinette is that when Moses used his seal often, it said Moses, the husband of Reinette. In other words, he wasn't identified as himself, but as his wife's husband. So I'll leave you with those questions to start off with, and then we can continue. Albert, why don't you start?
Yeah, that's a great question about the role of the clergy in the violence and the expulsion. It's definitely impossible to say that the clergy were not involved, but as I mentioned, in every single city, it would have the dynamics between Jews and Christians would have been very different. During the 14th century, there is more anti-Jewish rhetoric coming from clergy, especially from friars and kind of these mendicant friars who are moving through cities and preaching in the urban setting, and they were definitely pushing a lot of anti-Jewish rhetoric and also attacks on usury. But at the same time, as the source indicates, the clergy were not the driving force, at least in that specific case in Basel, according to Matthias of Neuenberg, that it's likely that the clergy could have been motivating some of the people in the crowd, but they're not the only factor to consider when we're thinking of violence and expulsion. That economic features would have been a huge factor, and just the other social institutions. And I think the most important thing to realize when we're thinking about the clergy is that definitely the most important cleric in all of Europe, the Pope himself, issued very early in 1348 a firm declaration that the Jews should not be held responsible for the spread of the epidemic. He was saying that Jews were equally affected by it, meaning that they couldn't have been responsible. And they also pointed out that the pandemic existed in places even without Jews. So in that way, you have actually the opposite of a religious figure strongly pushing more tolerance and the protection of the Jews.
Okay. Andreas, do you want to respond?
I muted myself. I start with the Jewish cemetery in Koblenz Alan asked about. It vanished. That's the reason why I couldn't show any images. There are very few stones that have survived. They have survived because they were used in other places as building material. This is a common feature we see with medieval Jewish cemeteries. Very few have survived. The cemetery in Worms is a good example, which fortunately has survived. But most cemeteries were at some point, especially after pogroms and expulsions, were destroyed because they were close to the city wall, sometimes part of the city. And therefore, it was a good place to use. It was also full of very precious, large, big stones that one could have used as building material. And we find them in houses, in city walls, in castles, and in churches. And this is one of the reasons why we sometimes can find some of these stones used as secondary building material. And for the question about Jewish women in business, and especially Margarete, Renette, who married the son of Margarete, is a very prominent example and a very special one. It is not usual that Jewish men would call themselves after their wives. One reason for this is most likely that Renette was extremely successful in business. And she conducted business already before with her husband, but as so often, because she was a widow, sorry, I forgot to say that. She was a widow for some time, and before her husband died, she conducted business together with him, but as so often, she stayed more in the shadow. This is also a feature we see very often, Jewish women becoming more present when they become widows. And before, they are just named in a row with their husbands, or even not mentioned, sometimes also not mentioned by name. This is very interesting, and still, they obviously were active in business as well, and did business together with their husband. Because after her first husband died, Renette, as a widow, conducted her business alone for quite some time, and obviously it was no problem. Having business relationships with other cities and even with noblemen and bishops. She lent money to bishops and other cities. This is how she made a fortune, and there are other examples like this. When Renette married Moses at a later stage, she already had a very important name. She was socially and economically wealthy and married into his family, which also had a high social status, and therefore was a fitting match. And we have many other examples of Jewish women being very successful, owning seals, owning personal seals, being precious members of their communities as donators, as tax collectors, and so on. I should also mention that, of course, Elisheva Baumgarten is the specialist for Jewish women in the Middle Ages, and she might want to add some notes.
Okay, I think I'll go on with the questions that we have at the moment. We'll have to come back for a different series tomorrow if we want to add some notes on some of the different aspects of what we've talked about here. So I'll just ask both Albert and Andreas to perhaps comment on what professions we find Jews occupying themselves in when they move or when they come back. Albert, maybe you have some evidence from your sources as well. Andreas has been making this one of his main projects over the past 2 years and going into the next few years, so he certainly has some evidence for this. And the second question that was asked in the chat is, where do Jews have money from? In other words, when we talk about Jews as money lenders, how do they have this money, especially after being dislocated, expelled, and under such persecution? So why don't we start again with Albert. Albert, you can give a brief answer, and then Andreas, and then we'll try to wrap things up. Okay?
Great. To give a brief answer, I'm just going to show one of the slides that I pulled up that I didn't mention. But you can see in this slide is how the area where Jews were living in Italy was very, very close to Germany. And one of the reasons why German immigrants or Jewish immigrants from Germany wanted to live in northern Italy is so that they could still have access to the trade that they were involved in Germany. So they were still very close to the people the connections that they had, as well as just the business contacts and the other people, so that even though that they were moving from Germany to northern Italy, they were still able to continue with some of the long distance trading or other things that they were involved in. I think that's very important. I suspect that outside of that, Andreas will have more to say, as Andreas is very its main topic of study currently is about all the other professions that Jews participated in outside of money lending. I'm gonna.
Yes, I will be happy to give a few notes about Jewish professions. We have seen last week already Nurit Derma talking about many different professions in Paris Jews held. In general, we find a broad spectrum of professions Jews had, of course. They often were physicians and made money with this. They could, in later stages, they could have been rabbis paid by their communities, which is the later 14th and especially 15th century development. But they also were, of course, tradesmen, and they were active in all kinds of crafts. It doesn't matter if it's a tailor or a shoemaker. We have examples for very different professions. And we even have very strange professions such as a mousetrap builder. And we don't know yet how much of these or how many of these professions really were enough to make a living. I imagine it was hard to live from building mousetraps. But these are the professions, they are mentioned in the sources, and obviously it was significant enough to manage to mention them. And this whole field still has to be studied. And I also want to mention, because we had the question about Jewish women, that women too were active in various professions, even such as scribes and copyists and physicians.
Okay, so I think we're going to thank you both here, and the other questions that we have, you can either email us, we are online, or pose them to us in a different way. What I want to do now, besides just thanking Albert and Andreas, and really thanking all the members of my team for such excellent presentations that we've had over the past 4 weeks. It's been, for me, a pleasure to listen to you, and I think that the people on the other side of the screen share that feeling. What I want to do is share my screen for just a second, and go back to one of the slides I showed you in my first presentation. And what I want to suggest to you is that we've heard almost all these sources from the different talks we've had the chance to listen to over the past week. And we've seen how rich the historical sources are for trying to create the past or recreate the past, reconstruct what happened, and try to understand the events that from afar we might interpret in one way, but when looking at them through these different sources, we get so many different perspectives on them. And they really become quite complex, like the world we're living in right now. And they allow us to appreciate both the complexity of the past and the many different paths that we hope the future we take. We hope that these paths will be ones of health and of prosperity and of peace rather than ones of persecution and expulsion. And I want to highlight two different things that we've seen here. I want to highlight these objects we've seen here, which were objects the Jews left behind that tell us something about the richness of their life during the period before the Black Death. And I also want to highlight the seal, which is one of many that Andreas has studied, but one of many that exist that really tell us about how the Jews reinstate themselves and reclaim their place and their authority in the world they live in after the Black Death as well as before. And really to say that it's my hope that through studying all the different kinds of texts and also this material culture, we can really gain a better understanding of the Jews of the past and a rich and complex understanding of the lives they led and the situations they faced, both as all of us are at times in the events of the world as victims, but also as agents. And it was very important to us here to show you the Jews, not just as the victims, but also as agents. And the last thing I want to say is that our project, Beyond Beit, really seeks to study so many different facets of medieval Jewish life, and to invite you, and our link is down here on the bottom of the screen, to visit our webpage, to look at our publications, to join our events. And this is really the time to thank Tamar Stampfer, who I'm not sure she knew what she was getting into when she reached out and asked me if I could give a talk. But we have tremendously enjoyed giving this series. And we thank Tamar, everyone at Beit Avichai, so Bruria and Gabrielle and everyone who's helped us. And thank all of you for listening to us over these past weeks. We hope to see you again at some future event. Thank you very much.